The following program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared in the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
And it is Saturday, and we are talking about money. Here on The Answer, we're talking about money. So I want to talk about a few things. Got a lot to cover today, so don't go away. We've got a lot to cover. The Money Show. I just came back from the Money Show last week. I was in the Money Show. I did 3 presentations. You've heard a lot of the information that I did in the presentation there. My first presentation was about the super cycle, about what's going on, about my predictions for 2020 and beyond. I said, we're in the super cycle, and there's a 8 to 10 year time period that's still left for us to prepare for what I presented in my third session. How will it end? I said, there's 8 to 10 years. It wasn't to scare anybody. It was to say, now is the time to prepare. Be ready for it. In the event it doesn't happen, in an event we don't end up in a high bout of inflation, you won't be sad at all to have this. So that was my first session. I said that 50% of the Standard & Poor's revenues come from outside the country, so you have to really be aware of what's going on in the rest of the world. You have to be aware of what's going on in China. You have to be aware of what's going on in the rest of the world, as well as in the United States. In order to predict well, you have to be aware of the rest of that. That was my first session. My second session was about how I have a passion for creating wealth. What I do, my 2 accounts, my $1 million account, and the regulators set it at $1 million. That's the minimum I can have in that account. It's a long-short account, so it's geared to take advantage of up markets. It's geared to take advantage of down markets. There is no fee associated with that account. It's simply a 20-80 split. It's very similar to hedge funds, except that hedge funds usually charge a management fee so that even if the account goes down, they get to charge. If the account goes down in the way I set it up, there's nothing that I get out of the account. So there's incentive to see that it does well, very well. And yet I know that taking excessive risk amounts normally to excessive loss. So I don't take excessive risk. I take moderate risk. And then, of course, I have my $100,000 minimum growth account, which is fee-based, which is the track record of which I've had for a long time. The fee sharing account has only been available for the last couple of years. So that's a new thing that's available. The fee-based account, that's been available for a long time. Now, I've been doing that for a long time. And my track record there is from the bottom of the market in 2009, 100,000 would have grown to 559,000 at the end of 2019. So a significant increase. I'm outperforming the Standard & Poor's 500 total return by 1%. Standard & Poor's, if you'd been able to buy that, would have grown to 506,000. So significantly better. 200,000 would have grown to 1.1 million. So that's what I talked about in the second session. And then in the third section, I talked about how this secular bull market's going to end. Surprisingly to me, because the third session was actually in the exhibit hall. Usually the exhibitors were getting 10, 15, 20 people showing up. I had my largest crowd at that one where I talked about how is it going to end. So that's what's going on in Orlando. They've asked me to do that in Las Vegas, and I will be doing that in Las Vegas. And they've asked me to also present in Seattle. It's coming up in the middle of June. I will be doing it there as well. I might shift things around a little bit because most people have heard what I have to say in Seattle. So I might talk about what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today is about a book that was written. It was a book written by Jerry Robinson. You may have seen him on Fox. He talks about the book. The book title is Bankruptcy: How America is Going to Go Bankrupt. You know, I believe that the book is wrong, and I'm going to take you through it today. But first a note, Bob Varies writes a column in Financial Advisor magazine, and he talked about how to become a noted financial advisor. He said just pick any old day, call a reporter or a TV channel host or hostess, and predict that the stock market's going to end up in a disaster. Something like we've never seen before, worse than 2008. Something that we will never, ever recover from. And he gave some examples of people that have done that. Andrew Roberts of the Royal Bank of Scotland predicted in June of 2010, yeah, that's 9 years ago, June of 2010, is that we were on the edge of a cliff, just around the corner for the banking system to completely fail. And he said, you can think the unthinkable. It's going to be so bad. You know, Mark Faber, he's called Dr. Doom. He predicted in 2009 we were going to see a bout of hyperinflation, with inflation running well over 100% per year because the Fed was injecting money into the system. In 2013, when that didn't happen, he came out and said we were going to have a 1987 type crash with no warning, and it would never recover. Roberts, who I mentioned before, came out and said, it didn't happen in 2010, but it's going to happen in 2016. Michael Lombardi from Profit Confidential said we were going to have a great crash in 2013. All of those get a huge play in the press because people are worried that that could happen, and it may happen. I don't think it's going to happen, but it gets big play in the press, and so did the book Bankruptcy: How America is Going Broke by Jerry Robinson. And what he said, I'm going to summarize the book for you, and then I'm going to examine each part of what he says. First of all, he said that empires, great nations, generally last just 200 years. After 200 years, they're pretty much done and they fade. And he doesn't give many examples, but he just makes that as a comment that, America's 200 years old and we're fading right now. That's his focus. Then he talks about money and the definition of money. What gives it value? Money can be backed by gold or silver or another commodity, so it's tied to that commodity. But otherwise, the dollar, if you look at it today, it's just a piece of paper. It's just a piece of paper. It has no real value except what people are willing to give it. And he said, the value of the dollar is people have faith in the scarcity. And once you begin to define it as having faith in scarcity, then scarcity has a special meaning. But we'll get to that. He says that's what the value of the dollar was. Then he goes back and talks about Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was a meeting in July 1944. There were 44 nations that came to meet. It's just at the end as World War II is coming to an end. 44 nations sent 730 delegates. John Maynard Keynes was there. Some of the most noted economists of the time attended that meeting. London had been the financial capital up until then, but London, faced with the debts from World War II, was suffering under the rebuilding process. And so what they came out of, the Bretton Woods discussion, is that they were going to tie the dollar bill to gold. And it was going to be $35 an ounce, $35 US dollars to every 1 ounce of gold. And then they were going to peg all the world's currencies to the dollar so that For example, we lived in France. In France, it took 5.42 francs to the dollar. The sterling had a different value. The lira had a different value. So then, and everything was fine because each one of those bills was backed by gold or silver. But in 1971, Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold. The United States had been on a spending spree, and that's true. Johnson had proposed the Great Society. We got Medicare at that time. We got the war on poverty. The national debt was growing during that time. And Nixon decided to uncouple the dollar from gold. And there was a run on gold. People were cashing in dollars for gold. And what Robinson said is that's because other countries were losing faith in the U.S. and the dollar. Then he went on to say it became petrodollars. The dollar was backed by oil. We made these agreements with Saudi Arabia. And he said that Saudi Arabia would give us oil for dollars. Everything was denominated in dollars. And everything depended upon Saudi Arabia and the American discussion. We're coming to a commercial break. Don't go away. I haven't even gotten through what Jerry Robinson had to say. So don't go away. We'll be back right after this commercial break and pick up where we left off.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I've been talking about the book that Jerry Robinson did called Bankrupt, How America is Going Broke. And I got through the first part where Nixon decoupled the dollar. He said that then the agreement was made between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. so that Saudi Arabia would give us oil for the dollars. And that's all that the dollar depends upon now, is it's backed by oil, primarily from Saudi Arabia. Then he talked about the Federal Reserve, and he said, he talked about some of the history. The first bank was formed in 1791 during the Revolutionary War, and it expired after a 20-year charter. The second bank formed in 1816 and actually was shut down early by Andrew Jackson. And he said that the ownership was 70% of the first bank was 70% owned by foreign interest. Then he talked about deficits, and he said that the Fed was printing money. The Treasury issued debt. The Fed prints money to cover the debt. And what he says is when we write a check, we have to have money in the account. But when the Fed issues a check, there's no money to cover it. It just simply creates money. It prints money. And he said what that means is that the purchasing power of the dollar has been falling for centuries. And the claim is that the dollar is losing the faith of foreigners, and that foreigners own all of our debt. He said banks create money too, but he said that America is the greatest debtor nation ever, which is true, but that the foreigners own all the debt, and especially Saudi Arabia and China. Went on to say that we have a $23 trillion national debt and $120 trillion in unfunded Social Security and Medicaid. And all that means is it's going to die one day. Now, I disagree with that. I disagree for this reason. Number one, I'll take you point by point. Number one, he said empires only last 200 years. Did he forget China? Did he forget Rome, Assyria, Egypt? I mean, he's talking about the American democracy as not being able to last. I disagree with it. We don't know. Maybe America will last 300 years. Maybe it'll last 1,000 years. Nobody knows for sure. Certainly, I disagree with his premise. Then he talked about the definition of money. And yes, when money was gold and silver and actually coins, I mean, we used to talk about 2 bits and 4 bits. That's because a $1 coin of silver, a $1, a silver piece that was worth $1, used to be hacked into 8 different pieces, so that a quarter was 2 of those bits. 4 of those bits were 50 cents. And that's how we got to the term 4 bits, 6 bits, because it was an actual piece of silver. There was no dollar until after the Civil War. Prior to that, states issued their own currency. But during the Civil War, it was costing $2.5 million a day, which was huge in those days. And they were selling treasury bonds for the first time. They weren't their full faith and credit. They didn't have worldwide backing. But when they couldn't find enough buyers, they began to print greenbacks, dollars. And until then, it had been the states. Eventually it would be the Internal Revenue Service that ended up financing it. But in 1860, before the start of the Civil War, the government had a $64 million debt. At the end of the Civil War, $2.2 billion, which was huge, huge, huge. That's more in terms of GDP than the debt is today. And the decision was made to pay down the debt, and they did that to $1.5 billion. Anyway, that's a whole different story. That wasn't covered in the book at all. But anyway, then he talks about Bretton Woods, and I agree. That's what happened. They decided 44 nations came together, 730 delegates. They pegged all the dollars, all the currencies in the world to the dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold at $35 an ounce. But when he gets to 1971, there's a difference I have with what he says. He said Nixon decoupled the dollar and moved it to petrodollars. If you look, I've talked about it on this program a number of times, inflation had been picking up since 1962. William McChesney Martin had been appointed Federal Reserve Chairman during the Truman administration. He was reappointed by Eisenhower, by Kennedy, by Johnson. Early in the Nixon administration, Nixon was worried about getting reelected, and he opted to go for Arthur Burns. Now, inflation had been picking up, and what Martin had started to do is Martin had started to raise interest rates to fight the increase of inflation. Now, you had 2 things going on at that time. When Nixon was running for a second term, you had the beginning of a recession, and you had inflation picking up at the same time. So Nixon was worried about his election. He appointed Arthur Burns to replace William McChesney Martin. Now, presidents have always put a lot of pressure on Federal Reserve chairmen. You read about Trump and what he's doing with Powell. That's been standard. During Johnson's term, when Martin was chairman of the Federal Reserve, Johnson invited Martin to his ranch in Texas. Johnson stood a head above Martin. He was taller. He grabbed Martin by the shoulders, shoved him up against a wall, and said, "You got to lower interest rates. We got boys in Vietnam being killed. You just got to lower interest rates." That's typical of what presidents do. It was typical. The only one that didn't happen is with Volcker and Reagan. Volcker met with Reagan, and James Baker was in the meeting. Reagan said, you have to lower interest rates. We've got all this inflation going. We've got high interest rates, and it's slowing down the economy. And Paul Volcker got up and said, "Thank you for the meeting, Mr. President," and walked out. He's the only one that denied the president. So Arthur Burns comes in. Arthur Burns had a background in the business cycle. Nixon wanted him to lower rates instead of raising rates, to fight, instead of fighting inflation, fight the recession. And so we ended up with stagflation. We ended up with inflation taking off. So it wasn't that foreign countries lost faith in gold. Gold was decoupled from the dollar in 1971. By 1974, the price of gold had risen from $35 to $180 an ounce. Into 74, it dropped 40% to $110, but then it began to raise. And by January of 1980, gold stood at $850 an ounce. Now, if you're a central banker in another country and you can trade your dollars for gold, wouldn't you do that? I mean, it just makes sense. If you can see gold is going, it was $35 an ounce and now it's headed to $850. Why not sell your dollars back to the U.S. Treasury, back to the U.S., take the gold in physical form and wait for gold to reach a high and then sell the gold back to the U.S. in dollars. I mean, you can make 25 times your money by doing that. Central bankers in other countries are not dumb. That was the run on the dollar. They could see it was running up. His point about Saudi Arabia. We signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia in 1951, but they were not our primary partner. Our primary partner during the Nixon and Kissinger years was not Saudi Arabia, it was Iran, the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran wanted to rebuild the Persian Empire. And in order to do that, he wanted to buy the latest military equipment. And to pay for the military equipment, he wanted to cut deals with oil. And there was a back channel. A lot of things written about that whole thing in a book called The Oil Kings. It talks about the negotiations between Kissinger, Nixon, and the Shah of Iran. Iran wanted a U.S. military base, and so did the Nixon administration. They wanted Iran to be our anchor in the Middle East. All that would come apart in 79, but at that time, as we decoupled the dollar from gold, it was not the idea to back up with oil, as Robinson says in the book. It was simply that the Shah wanted to rebuild the Persian Empire. The United States had an interest in seeing that Iran was the anchor in the Middle East. And that's where we ended up with the Middle East. Finally, he talks about the history of the Federal Reserve. And yes, we had a central bank from 1791. We had to form a central bank in 1791 because we had a time like 2008 following the Revolutionary War. There needed to be a way to finance it. And it was the Bank of England and the Bank of France that poured money into our central bank and funded our central bank. And so that was the ownership. That was the question. That's where it was. It wasn't that it was owned by the foreigners. It was because they funded. And it was the Bank of England that bailed out the first Great Recession in 1848. We had no central bank in 1874, 1890, 1893, or 1907, or a couple other times when we went through times like 2008. But that led to the foundation of the Federal Reserve. That was a big thing. So then he begins to talk about deficits and talk about trade and national deficits. And it's true. The Fed does create money when it pours money, when it buys bonds in the open market. And it has no cash. It doesn't have anything in the bank account. It simply is a matter of printing money. It creates money. It's the same for banks when they loan money and they have to have a reserve. When you do the math on it, it's a significant amount of creation of money. We're going to come back to this after the commercial break. We're coming to a commercial break. It's important to understand because as I go to these conferences and see the number of people that are talking about the bankruptcy of the U.S. and see the basis on which they're talking, it's important to understand it's not valid. But we're going to come back to this after the break. And I have a guest you want to hear. We're probably going to close the program with him. So don't go away. We've got a lot to cover. I'll be right back after this commercial break. Don't go away. And if you miss any of this program, you can hear it on YouTube. You can also find it on a podcast on our website. Don't go away. I'll be right back.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Okay, so I've been talking about this book, Bankruptcy by Jerry Robinson. Bankruptcy, How America is Going Broke. And he talks about the value of the dollar has been shrinking. He talked about people losing faith in the dollar And the only value that the dollar has is the scarcity of the dollar. And what's happening is that scarcity is going away. When you talk about money in the broadest terms, which it is it's the GDP, the growth of the economy. When the stock market increases 10%, that's creating an additional 10% of money over the stock market. Not total in the system, but if the stock market is 10 trillion and it goes to 11 trillion, that's creating $1 trillion of money because you can sell those stocks and get dollars for them. So it's not just the Federal Reserve that's printing money. Time and again, you hear people say the Fed is just printing money. So how does that really work? So how that works is this. Quantitative easing was the Fed printing money. They go into the market. They say, we want to buy treasury bonds or distressed assets. The CDOs, the CMOs, they went out, they bought those, they paid for those in US dollars. They didn't have any dollars really. They created that just out of thin air. They say, we're going to deposit that to your account. Think about it this way. If you have a $100 bill, you go into the bank, you put the $100 bill down, you deposit it. What happens to it? It becomes a mark on your ledger. You can write a check for $100, and the check will balance because that's another entry of the ledger. There's not a cash that passes through. If you write a check for $100, the merchant you write it to or the friend you write it to can take it to the bank and get $100, but usually they take the check, they deposit it to the bank, and that's an entry in theirs. There's no real physical currency that trades. So in the case of the Fed, if they want to create money, if they want to do what's called printing money, they simply make a mark in the ledger. They say, from Mike, we bought a $100,000 bond, and we're going to credit your bank account $100,000, and we're going to take possession of that bond. Sure, the Fed doesn't have any money. It just is an entry in your bank account, or in Chase, or in Bank of America, or in Goldman Sachs, or Merrill Lynch, or whoever it might be. They just make an entry on their account, and they acquire the bonds. That's printing money. That's what they did during 2008. That's what they did to heal the economy. That's something central banks have been doing for centuries. They simply create the money. Now, they reversed that process, and Janet Yellen started to reverse the process by letting bonds expire. Those bonds that they bought in the open market, they let them mature. And when they mature, they get the money from the Treasury. So the Treasury gives them the money, makes a deposit into the Fed account, and they're de-printing money. Nobody talks about de-printing money. They always talk about printing money. And yes, right now we're going through a process where the Fed is once again printing money, putting money into the system because they're trying to lower rates, and that's a whole different issue. But they're not the ones that create the most of the money. The stock market creates far more money than the Fed does. The stock market in what's gone on between 2009 and the current day has created trillions of dollars of money. Whereas the Fed pumped a lot of money in during the crisis. They're taking money out. That's slowly coming out as bonds mature. The stock market creates money. Banks create money. Think about this. When the bank gets a $1,000 deposit, they have a reserve. Take it, it's 5%, but suppose it's 10. That means they loan out $900 and they put 10%, $100 in reserve. That $900 gets deposited back into the bank, and now they have to take $99 for a reserve, $90 for a reserve, and they're loaning $810. So in total, that $1,000 has created $1,700 in loans. It'll continue to create money. It will create almost $10,000 worth of loans, $10,000 worth of money. The reverse process happens when the loans are paid off, but they'll re-loan to somebody else. During the crisis of 2008, you remember that the focus of the Treasury was to make sure that banks had the ability to borrow money at zero interest. They still do. That is to fund that. and make sure that they don't decreate money. None of that's printing money. That's the banks that are doing that. The Fed can and does, during crises, step in and create money. But they're not creating all the money that's created. That's created in other ways. So that's that aspect. Finally, the last point he made is that the U.S. Treasury, or the U.S. national debt, is $23 trillion, and it's held by foreign governments. Not true. 30% is held by foreign governments. 70% is held in the U.S. And central banks are not just buying our debt, they're buying our stocks too. But that's another idea. So the other issue is Medicaid and Medicare. Yes, that is. But that can be solvable by raising the ceiling on Medicare deductions, increasing the retirement age. Just an increase of 1.5% of the withholding to 13.9 would close the entire gap for Social Security. Medicare's got to be solved with focusing on the healthcare system. So in conclusion, Bankruptcy, it's a book that's based on false notions, that's based on misinformation. It's based on trying to gain a lot of publicity. I'm back to the Bob Veras example that I started with. If you're a financial advisor and you want to make a big splash and get very well known in a very short time, you call up a newspaper or you call up a TV station and you say that the stock market is going to hit a disaster. It's something like we've never seen before. It's going to be worse than 2008, and it will never, ever, ever recover. Or you can write a book about it. And you get on Fox News, you get on CNBC, you get a lot of publicity out of writing a book called Bankruptcy, The Death of America. Anyway, I disagree 100%. I think that we're headed toward some good times. One thing it doesn't count on is the changes that are happening in technology and culture. And for that, I have a guest today that's going to talk about some technology changes. Vince Bryant of Whoosh Innovations is back with us. He was here just 5 years ago, just as things were getting started, but he's going to update us. So welcome to the program, Vince.
Thank you very much.
So like normal, why don't we start with some of your background?
Sure. My personal background?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was an attorney for Whoosh, for Adobe Systems for a number of years, and our family as well had a bunch of business interests. And so after leaving Adobe, I went back to the family business, and we were involved in agriculture with apples and grapes. Our family had started the Gorge Amphitheater, and we had a burgeoning winery and hotel operation over in Eastern Washington that I was helping to pull together and get up and going, and we were very successful with that. It was during that time that we started to understand the problems of both immigration as it related to agriculture, and then the competition between the need for water, both for hydropower purposes, for irrigation purposes, and the purpose of fish passage. And it was in that space that we decided to get creative.
And you did get creative. You created Whoosh.
What
a name.
We created Whoosh Innovations because we quickly realized this was a worldwide problem, and the term whoosh was something that people could really relate to. It was a sound, and it's a sound in the invention of the fish moving through the fish tube that we've created, and it's a whoosh.
So from a mile-high view, what you're talking about is when you have a dam, the fish, when they swim upriver to reproduce, they need to get past the dam.
Exactly.
And what your tube does is do it in a very good way.
Yeah, we like to think so. If you think about the way that we have addressed this problem in the past, you hear about fish ladders or fish lifts or trap and haul, which is where they capture the fish and then they truck the fish around the barriers. It's a very all those options are very expensive and very inefficient, and they have real problems associated with them, both for the fish, but also for those who are operating those facilities. And the results over the years has been declining fish populations, despite enormous monies being spent to try to remedy that with the old solutions. And so our mission here was really to find a way that both the dams and the fish and the ag could all be beneficiaries of a new technology.
Okay, and we're going to come back and talk about how that all came together right after this commercial break, so don't go away. This is an important story to understand. I mean, this is part of our environment. This is part of who we are. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this commercial break.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Taking care of business. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I'm here with Vince Bryant of Whoosh Innovations. We just got started talking about it, gave the mile high view, moving fish up over the dam. So go ahead and tell us more about Whoosh.
Sure. So we didn't realize, I think, when we got into this, that the problems were as complex as they were. There was not only the technology issues that we had to overcome, but there were regulatory issues and sort of a politicization of the problem that made it difficult to navigate. But we had come from a place of science and really trying to understand the root causes of the issues and to try to parse through all of the misinformation, I think, that is characterized in a debate. If you're talking about taking down a dam, for example, not all of it is based on fact, but it is based on an argument that you use to try to win your case. And too often, the cases were finding their way into the courtrooms themselves, and that was what was defining our policies regarding fish passage. So we looked at the problem and said, clearly what we are doing isn't working. The ladders are there in some places, but most places there are no ladders, and there are no ladders because it's so expensive to put in a ladder. And then even today, where there are ladders, we're seeing the fish failures, and this is causing us to think about having to take down all the dams.
So when you talk about fish failures, I think you mentioned when we had lunch that the fish in the Columbia River, the number of salmon has declined from 10 million to 1 million, and that the predators are feeding on the salmon.
Yeah, it's what's happening is there's an invasive species that are in the rivers today that the ladders actually can help enable those fish to move into the system. So just as an example, on the Columbia River, there was 7.6 million shad that came into the river this year, compared to less than a total of 1 million salmon. Well, that's a lot of fish that are in the river. In fact, it's almost near the historical levels if you count the total number of fish. So the biomass is actually not all that different from what it has been historically. It's just changed. And why has it changed? You can contribute this to a number of factors, but certainly part of it is that in this instance, the American shad was introduced from the East Coast down in the American River down in California, and they worked their way up the coast and then came into the Columbia and found conditions there that allowed them to really flourish. So we thought a big part of the problem here is that in fish passage, it isn't about passing all fish. It is about passing the native fish. And we must have an opportunity then to remove an invasive species, or if it's a hatchery fish, to divert the hatchery fish to the hatchery rather than having them go upriver and then compete with the native fish. And if we can manage the fish as they're passing the dams in such a way that we're controlling which fish are moving forward and so forth, and removing the fish that shouldn't be there, we're actually cleaning up the rivers at the same time that we're giving the salmon a better chance, in this instance in the Columbia River. And it affects the downstream passage as well, because you don't have the predators who hang out at the dams, both above the dam and below the dam, then eating them, eating the juveniles as they're heading back out to sea. So it really has been throwing out all the assumptions that we've made and looking at what the data is really telling us. And so the technology operates a fish. You'll hear people refer to as the salmon cannon. That's because the fish are moving through a tube at a rapid speed, about 25 feet per second, and it doesn't matter how high for us. They don't fly through the air, but they are gliding within the tube. It's a misted tube. The temperature is controlled in the tube, and we're able to do it with very little energy and very little air pressure differential. And we can move in a single system about 60,000 fish in a day. So that's a lot of fish.
Yeah. So let me ask a question. So you mentioned separating the fish. Hatchery fish one way, native fish another way, predators. So how do you identify what the fish are?
Yeah. When we were in the ag business, we became very much aware of the packing houses and what they were doing with scanning and sorting of technologies. And there in fruit, you separated fruit based on size, color, and whether there was a defect on that. And we thought, why don't we bring this technology to fish identification? And that's essentially what we did. We had to make a bunch of hardware changes, software changes, and then we had deep learning and AI come along all at about the same time that we were working on this. So what we do is we have a scanning system. The fish swims in and then slides for a second. They're out of the water, and at that moment, as they're coming into our system, there's a moment of total clarity where we can capture 18 images of the fish within a fraction of a second. And it's those images that we then use and do an analysis with the computer. That analysis goes through the algorithm, and within a fraction of a second, we're making a decision as to what to do with that fish based upon the identification. We developed that algorithm by having originally captured 1,000 images that way, and used deep learning and AI to help us create that algorithm. So once it's created, we've identified the species and so forth. The system is very quick to sort.
So how do you separate hatchery fish from non-hatchery, from native?
Yeah, there's two different ways in this state that they mark hatchery fish. One is they can put a tag on the fish, a pit tag, which is something that's internal to the fish, but that you can pick up with a pit tag detector, a reader. The other way, and perhaps the more common way, is they will snip the adipose fin off the fish. That's a small fin that's behind the dorsal fin. And so when we have the image of the fish, we're just identifying whether that adipose fin exists or not.
That's great. So you started this process 5 years ago. You were still doing a lot of handwork. Now it's all automated. How many places have you gone with this system?
Yeah, we've been in a number of places around the world, from Sweden to China to Argentina. We have been in all of those locations. The number of systems deployed is still a modest number. It's only in the tens, 20 to 30, I would say, full systems that have been deployed. And if you consider that there's 1 million dams in the world, and fewer than 3% of those have any kind of fish passage at all, you know that you need a lot of systems. In fact, in the United States, we need to put out 11 systems a day to get all 85,000 dams covered in the next 20 years.
Wow, that's huge. But it's also really important.
It is, if you think about it. Hydro has got to be part of our clean air. We need the fish as a protein in most of the world. And nature is what gives us all our life, I think, beyond our work lives. And to bring that all together in one place and is our goal.
Well, thanks for being on the program. Thanks for being here. It's an important thing that you're doing. So we wish you all the very best, and we will hear from you again in 5 years. No, maybe sooner.
Hey,
anyway,
no.
Thanks for being on the program.
Talk to your legislators.
That wraps us up for today. I'll be back next Saturday.
Listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on AM 1590. The Answer. The preceding program was sponsored by Adams